All right, and we're recording. So, Vitaly, please tell me about yourself.
Hi, my name is Vitaly. I'm an iOS engineer, and I started my career path 11 years ago. Started as freelancer, worked around 7 years as freelancer with some different platforms with different clients. Then I joined to startup called Authentic, which is startup in identity verification area. I worked in a small team. We had the biggest stage for developers. And then 2 years ago, I joined to another company called Delivery Hero, which is a food delivery company and quick commerce company. The team is bigger here. I believe in total we have around maybe 50, 60 iOS developers. And of course, there's developers for other platforms. That's in short about me.
Got it. All right, so I guess we're not going to be wasting too much time on this, and we'll just straight to the question. So the question is, we want to design Reddit. Are you familiar with Reddit?
Yes, I'm familiar with Reddit. So, good. So let me first of all clarify requirements. Just one question. Can you see? You can see my screen, one screen,
Yep.
because I have two of them. Good, perfect. So let me think. As a user, I guess I want to see, first of all, a list of topics and somehow do search through them. And at some point, I want to go to topic details. Am I right? Or thread? Let's call it thread.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, so you will want to see a list of threads, and you might want to enter this thread. And what I would add on top of that, we also want to like posts.
See thread details. Like post in a thread. Yes.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Do we need search functionality, or we can?
We can leave it out of scope for now. So if we're gonna have time, we can come back to it.
Let me think. Do we have any requirements about offline? Should our app work offline or with cached data?
What's your recommendation?
I would say, let me think. If we consider Reddit, so most likely you would like to have some kind of real-time interaction to see updated information, but maybe at some post you would like to save and to review this information. So I would recommend to proceed with caching approach. So as soon as we have something cached on device, we display it if we don't have internet connection. Let me think about other cases. Search will leave it out of scope. Do we need a real-time notification updates about, let's say I favorite some thread and I would like to get notification about updates in this
So what
thread.
I want to see, if somebody likes a post, you won't want to see notification, like user X liked the post.
Notification if someone liked the post. And I believe in functional requirements, we also need to have, user should have ability to create a thread. Am I right? And post.
Let's just pretend that, like, is this functionality exists, so we can leave it out of scope now.
Okay. Good. Let me think about other cases. Do we have some specific security requirements, or it will be kind of public information that we that will not be some sensitive?
What is your recommendation? What do you think?
I would say it depends on the business requirements. If we consider some worldwide application, I would not like invest for now at this stage, at MVP stage, a lot of insecurity. But we can consider it for the future. For example, if we want to make some private post, then we need to add maybe some encryption layer, need to think about it more.
Okay.
Then let me think about other cases. What platforms we are targeting? iOS, Android, or maybe desktops?
Let's just start with iOS.
Okay, iOS only. Do we have restriction in iOS version? Because it may affect development speed at some point.
What's your recommendation? How far back should we go?
I would recommend to take 3 versions back. That's general recommendation. It will cover around 98% of devices. But looking at the spread, the scale of the app, we may support some lower versions. but it will, as I mentioned, it may affect space of development. So let's say -3 from latest.
Okay.
Localization support, analytics.
We can put it out of scope.
Okay. And analytics. I need to have a few more information about how many users do we plan to have, or daily active users, monthly active users, what our scale?
We're going to have 1 billion users every month.
Per month. Good. And what is our target market? I assume it will be worldwide.
Worldwide.
And thing is, what about developer team? How many developers? Do we have restrictions in developers and deadline restrictions, or do we have unlimited?
Let's say it's unlimited and we don't have strict deadlines.
Why I'm asking is because if we have unlimited dev, maybe we should consider modularization. Will be very important because we can speed up our development process.
Right.
I guess that's it. We can continue to and start high-level diagram. So first of all, one more question that I forgot to ask. Are we designing client, mobile client, or mobile client plus API, or also backend side?
Let's scope it to client and API. So you may assume that you already have a backend, it's auto-scalable, unlimited resources, etc.
Okay. Then we will need to have some push notification service. And this will be our backend part. So let's then start with very high-level diagram. I would start with app module, which will be used to, first of all, generate dependency injection graph. And it will be used to start navigation. So app module will not have knowledge about detailed flows. By flow, I mean group of files that implement some functionality, for example, like a list of threads, threads list flow. And we will have threads details flow. Then let me think. We need to, let me come back to requirements. See thread details like post pow. Sorry. Excalibur a little bit. Okay, now it should be better. Good. So I see these two big flows that we need. And of course, we need to some way to interact with our backend. I would recommend to use some API service to create API service layer, but because we also implement caching mechanism, I would move it for now as separate module, but we can discuss later. I think we can use some, there's few approaches that we can use. And another thing is that we, in order to handle API layer, network layer, and caching layer without flows, that flow will know how exactly it implemented, I would recommend to introduce some repository entity that will first hide details of how network and caching logic working, and provide some general way to get a list of threads or thread details. So let me think. And also, because we have push notification, we may need push notification, at least in iOS. They will come to app level, to app delegate level, and then we need somehow to handle it. So I would recommend to create separate entity that will handle push handling, that will handle push notifications, and then accordingly it may for example, update, notify repository about changes, or maybe even trigger some navigation in case, depending on the type of push notification messages, but we can come back to that. Then let me think. And the flows, they do not know about their other flows directly. Rather, they notify navigation layer that, hey, in thread list flow, user want to see thread details, and then navigation will decide how to display these thread details. Will it be presented as thread details, or maybe we can somehow we want to change this somehow in the future. So that is the reason of introducing this separate navigation layer.
Okay, I have a quick question. So when you said that like flows would not know about each other and they would communicate via navigation. So two questions. How would they do that? Like, would you introduce like callback mechanism, or how exactly it would tell navigation what it needs to do? Because like, would each flow know about navigation, or how would they connect?
Very good question. I would recommend, I mean, there's few approaches to this, and I would recommend the way where flow has no idea about navigation flow. It has some kind of callbacks or coroutines in case of Android. Or if you're using React, you decided to use reactive programming, some kind of observable, that they will generate event, hey, something is happened in thread list. We want to open when thread details, and navigation flow will know. Sorry, not flow. Navigation layer will know about all flows and observe them or listen to them, and then as soon as it detect event, let's say show thread details, it will act accordingly. Let's say like start thread details flow. So this is main idea.
So basically, navigation would run business logic. So it's a component which would know how to move between screens or switching between flows, but also it knows how to talk to like your like domain layer. Or I'm just trying to understand like what's the scope of responsibility of the navigation component.
You're right. There will be two responsibilities of navigation flow. One is business logic, and second is implementing exact navigation. But I would rather separate them into two separate entities. So exact implementation of navigation, let's say it will be present in modally, or I don't know, push into navigation stack, or any other way of implementation, should be implemented separately. And there will be protocol between navigation business logic and navigation, let's say navigation UI navigation logic. And then navigation business logic will have, again, it will have event, something like show thread details with additional information, like which exactly thread it need to show, like some initial information. Then it will create necessary dependencies, provide some necessary dependencies to thread details flow, and add this information, which exact thread it need to show, and then uses this UI navigation, how it's called, layer, do exact navigation, I mean UI navigation. So this is the main idea of this.
Got it. All right, let's switch gears a bit and talk about repositories. So I can see that you have a repository component. Would this component be shared across every flow you have? Or how would you organize it?
That's a very good question. So there is, let me think. If we have, the thing is, I believe that repository should be shared if we are working with the same entities. I mean, for example, if we are working with threads and we are performing same operations on them, I believe we can have shared repository itself, but at the same time, in order to not to disclose a lot of information about repository, because we may have a lot of function, We can have separate protocol definition for thread details flow. So, for example, it will just need to get detailed information about thread, I mean, get all posts, etc. But it doesn't care about thread list. But threads list need to have ability to get thread list from repository, for example, or maybe search, or maybe do something. So I would recommend here to use single class to not duplicate a lot of business logic, because if we introduce two different repositories for our flow, then we all of them should work together with caching. We also need to duplicate some code. I would rather recommend to proceed with single repository and define two different protocols for each flow. But one repository will adopt both protocols. That is my suggestion for this case. For our
That makes sense. Imagine that your team is really large. So you have 40 people working on thread list and 40 people on thread details. Who would own repository?
That's a good question. I would recommend to dedicate, we can even dedicate separate team to own repository. As you mentioned, we have unlimited developers. But we should keep in mind that if we distribute some work between different teams, then communication became a problem. I mean, delays in communication, some team working on other tasks. So we may have faced with these problems. And that's a very good question. Maybe delegating it to one team will speed up development. It also depends on amount of features. Let's say in particular this example, we have not a lot of features, so I would rather not introduce a lot of teams. I would rather recommend to, like in the best case scenario, dedicate each flow to separate team, dedicate navigation logic to separate team, and then repository API service to one more team.
Got it. So in terms of source code organization, imagine you have this gigantic project, right? So now different teams working on different components. Like in terms of like version control, how would you store the code? Would you put everything in separate repos? Would you put them in single repo? Like which way would you adopt?
That's a very good question. I would synchronize this with business requirements and plans of the company, because if we are doing some MVP and we do not have a plans to push it to the big scale, that's one case. But as you mentioned, we have about 1 billion of users. At most likely we will scale a lot. That's mean in most likely in nearest future we will add more and more features. So in this case we have few approaches. First, we can put everything in one project and in one repo. In this case, we may have problems with conflicts during merging features from different teams that they need to handle. There's another approach where we can use frameworks, particularly if we are talking about iOS. We can use dynamic frameworks and static frameworks, and there is pros and cons in this case. So for dynamic framework, it will increase size of binary application. Also, it will increase load time a little bit. But at the same time, if you don't use this dynamic library, it may not load into the memory. So we can have maybe a little bit less memory usage if this module will not used. Also, we can proceed with static libraries. In this case, you can consider it as binary code that will be embedded inside the app. So it will be slightly less binary size because compiler may remove unused entities according to its own logic. Also, the startup time will be slightly less in this case, and it will allow. But there's one disadvantage. There was one disadvantage of static frameworks, that they cannot use resources. They don't have bundle resources. But in recent Swift version, it was fixed, and there's right now possibility to do this. And in case if we will use framework, dynamic or static, we can extract each module to separate repo with separate project. That can be covered. There's few advantages of this. It can be covered by tests separately. Modularity will be kind of forced. I mean, in order to integrate this framework into app, you cannot have direct dependency on some internal app logic. You need to write mediator layers to connect your, for example, thread list flow with the main app. It will increase at one point. It will increase amount of code that you need to write, and but at another point, it will force developers of framework to maintain better architecture.
So which approach would you select?
I would recommend to proceed with static frameworks. Looking at scale, I would recommend proceed separate Git repositories for each project and static frameworks as the way how to gather everything together. And of course, there will be main app project that will handle connect everything together.
Got it. All right. So let's switch from high level to like more detailed discussion, and tell me about the API, like which would you use. So I'm mostly interested for the part which gets list of threads.
Okay, list of threads. Let me maybe start like this. List of threads. If I would think about list of threads, first thing that comes to my mind is we can have a lot of threads. I mean, 1 billion user will generate a lot of information. So first of thing, we should consider pagination. There's few ways to implement this. Frankly, I do not have any strong preference because I worked with only one way of pagination, offset and page. But I know that there's a way by using cursor or, for example, date instead of cursor. Or, I mean, not date, but timestamp, get posts after or get threads after some specific date time. I don't have any strong preference, and I would rather discuss it with organized discussion with backend team and more rely on their decision about exact way of pagination. Because for mobile, it will not affect a lot complexity of implementation. Then if I would think about protocol, we don't have, I don't see any usage of real time. At least I don't see this in the requirements. So in this case, I would recommend to proceed with HTTP REST protocol. And we will have get endpoint, API endpoint to get thread list with specific for specific page, let's say. And if we let me quickly write like get threads and pagination will be somehow maybe let me write it like this. We should consider pagination as parameters. Let me think what else I will need. Maybe I can also dive into details of API response and try to design a thread model. What do you prefer?
I would say I'm interested, like how would you build your API in general? Would there be like any checks you would add, like any cases which you might want to handle?
Okay. So let's say I'm getting threads, and first of all, need to think about response that I will get, and I would proceed the way where I have data object with array of threads, where thread will be will have some ID, then it will have author or in terms of displaying from UI, maybe we need to have some maybe title and first, let's say, 3 or 2 messages, depending on UI requirements. exact number we can decide looking at UI requirements or discussing with designers I mentioned before. And date. I can like, if I remember correctly, posts, but not thread. Am I right?
Just you're not gonna post anything. Oh, I mean, you're asking about likes or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just number of likes for a single post.
Okay. Good. And with this, let me think about, we did not talk about caching layer and how we implement this. And, but first of all, let me think about what potential problems we can have. 1 billion users. That's mean we should really care about amount of data that we are transferring. That's smaller data, that's better. First of all, of course, zip compression should be enabled in HTTP headers because it's supported by the most of the clients. It will reduce size a lot. Then we can think about which sorry, I forgot the word. We can use different protocols like JSON, XML, or for example, protobuf, because if I remember correctly, protobuf will be will have a smaller size. So, but it also depends again on discussion with backend team. If we have some restriction from them, of course we will be limited to that. But I would recommend to proceed with protobuf because of the size. Then let's say user opened the app and we tried to get a list of threads. Let's say he got an error, and here I see few things that we should consider. First of all, in our application, we should handle the case when there's too much load on our servers, and we got error that shows, hey, we are overloaded. If I remember, I don't remember correctly, is there a specific HTTP status code for this? Or we can do this for 500 error, I mean general error. In this case, I would recommend to use exponential backoff, or maybe not exponential. Again, better to discuss it with the backend team. Is better because I'm not sure at this scale which solution will be better, but we definitely need to have some kind of backup so our application will not DDoS our server in case of some problem. Okay, what other problems we can have? Let me think. Authorization, if I remember correctly, we do not have in our app, so we can.
Like we don't have, but it might be good to include authorization to each request because otherwise, like anyone can send request and just start bombarding and create a DOS attack.
Yeah, very good question. How to implement authorization in this case? Frankly, I didn't have experience with exactly, let's say, hidden authorization. But what we can do, let me think what we can do here.
I mean, if you haven't worked with that, it's fine. We can switch gears and move on and try to cover like more ground.
Up to you. I can try to speculate, but as I mentioned, I'm not sure if my solution will be correct for this case.
That's fine. So, okay, so now we know that we have pagination. We're gonna get a list of threads. And how would we persist it?
That goes to the caching layer, which I believe in our case, we need to persist it. But if we're talking about caching, I would always think about different types of caching. First, we have HTTP caching policy, which may be useful, but I'm not sure if in our case we can use it. Because if I remember, if we are talking about requirements, it would be nice to store everything that we load. And then if user open app offline, we display it. I don't remember how exactly HTTP cache policy works in this case, so I would consider another option. For example, we can store all received information in database, and then this in this case cache will be kind of persistence and source of true, but we should consider few things. So first of all, we can have a lot of information cached, and we need to define a policy how to clean our cache. We can use few approaches here. First is most like least recent thread. Then, for example, thread that is was not viewed. So like last, not last viewed, but opposite. I mean, again, sorry, I forgot the right.
It's okay. I think I know what you're saying, but in terms of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the thread list itself, but the content of a thread. So like because thread list is like it's not very exciting. So imagine you open a thread and you start like scrolling. So how would data flow? Like when would you request data? What you would store, and how would you invalidate cache?
Very good point. So as soon as I open thread in details flow, I need to get information again. Thread can be very long. Posts can have a lot of posts. That's mean we need to implement pagination in this case. And particular in this case, I believe maybe pagination by date, like get posts after some date will be reasonable, unless we have posts editing that will change things little bit. Should I consider for now editing ability to edit an existing post, or
No,
we
I
can?
don't think we should add anything on top of that. I'm
Okay.
just trying to understand. Okay, so you sent a paginated request. So you got like one page of posts, right? So what happens next?
Next, I believe we need to. It would be nice to have separate table in database. Or separate entity that will keep posts for specific thread. And but the thing is that, let me think. If I would think about case, I opened some thread, I see a lot of posts, then I closed my app, went to background, and in 1 week I open it again. I open it same thread. If I would show this old information, and then it will be reloaded in 2 seconds, it will look quite weird for user. So maybe in this case, I see few approaches. First, we can use same approach but notify user in some non-blocking way. Hey, this information is like not up to date, like 1 week ago, and we are updating it so user is aware what happens. Second thing is we may invalidate thread detailed information after some time. Let's say reasonable value. I'm not sure what will be reasonable value, but I would definitely recommend to use remote configuration for this kind of thing, so we can adjust it without releasing new version of app from the backend. So after 1 day, let's take, for example, 1 day. If we take Reddit, it would be nice to get fresh information. We can invalidate it. Also,
imagine like sorry to interrupt. Imagine a use case. So you have a thread with, for example, called news, right? And it's like something happened. So you might not want to wait for a day to know about it, right? So you open it and it said like, hey, it might be stale, so you would need to go and refresh. But otherwise, it would take 1 day to update. Imagine the other case. There's a thread about like some, I don't know, antique furniture, which doesn't have much of a traffic. So someone posts there like once a month. So would you still apply the same expiration for like 1 day? And where would you configure it?
In these terms, I would go with something, maybe something different approach to get thread details, not only by pagination, but get updates after some date. Let's say I opened this new thread 1 week ago. We get information, and then I open it today. I ask Sarah, hey, can you get me on the updates from the last opened. But you are right. For some specific threads, we may have we may want to have different cache clean policies. And that's a very good question. I see one option is store this together with thread model, but I'm not sure if it will be really, I would just say, maybe useful, not useful. It will increase our model, and will it provide so much value to us? So I would rather investigate behavior and threats. Or maybe let me think about different approach. What if we can clean our cache depending on the number of posts? Let's say if we reach limit 300 of posts in the cache for some specific thread, we can clean up the oldest one, and in this case we can keep our cache up to date at the same time, and don't need to introduce these additional entities for caching policy for every thread, which I believe not a good idea in this case.
Okay, so basically, like, we're stepping back. So instead of trying to introduce like caching and invalidation for each thread, we would use like a system-wide default. It's fine. The question, like, how would we configure those policies?
That's definitely should not be hard-coded. We can come up with some app default value, but exact value I would recommend to fetch from remote configuration from the backend. And if we would think about default value, that will require investigation on data that user will generate and user behavior. And I think that one of the most important metric we should think about the size of the post. I mean, how big posts people are writing. That's mean, for example, if each post will have 1,000 characters, then it doesn't make sense to keep 300 posts. We can keep, for example, 50, because people most likely in most of the case will not scroll up too much. But if I would think about default value, if we consider something like Reddit, let's say we have 100 characters per post, that's mean we need to have 2 to 4 lines on a mobile device to display. That's mean on one screen we can fit, let's say, from 10 to 20. Let's take maybe 20 for example. How many screens people would like to see without being, without seeing this loading? I would say I would consider. Let me think. It also depends on how fast user will scroll, but we can come with some value. Let's say 10 to 20 screens. So let's multiply 20 multiplied by 20. That's mean 400.
So let me stop you here. So basically, your idea, we allocate the cache size based on the maximum number of posts for one store. And it's calculated based on how many posts you can see per screen and the number of screens we're going to prefetch. Something like this, right?
Yeah, we can do like this, but this will require, let me think. If we would go with this way, what disadvantage, what pros and cons we can have? Let's say I cache. Yeah, maybe it will be a good way, just because it will be some devices can have different screen, and it will be really differs from very small device to very big device, and having 2 times smaller cache for a smaller device makes sense. Also, I would consider also additional multipliers for depending on the device free space on device. So, for example, if we have device with 100 gigabytes, we like apply 100% of our calculated value. But if we see that the device has, let's say, 2 gigabytes we can say we can reduce it. Let's say we can take only 30% of our calculated value just to not overgrow the cache. But also we can have multiple cache cleanup policies by size, I mean by overall cache size, by amount of posts, as I mentioned before, by the frequency of viewing some thread. So I would apply multiple policies in our case because it will be quite important, especially if user will use our app in very intense way. Cache may grow too much and affect user experience with device.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about images. So would you cache images? How would you cache them, and how would you fetch them?
So for images, I would use separate cache entity and separate image loading, like separate image loading entity that will handle cache also. And in terms of images, first of all, I would consider to have separation between thumbnail and full-size image, because looking at the traffic, it may be really a lot. And consider one more thing, maybe it makes sense to provide a desired size of image. I mean, on device, we can calculate, let's say, on my screen size, this image in this UI should have, let's say, 100 screen points. So I can provide, I can make a request to CDN on server. Hey, can I get image with the size 100? Of course, multiplying by scale of the device. And in this case, we can reduce traffic, of course, if CDN will support this and it will make sense. We can also go with slightly different policy, like having a few different, let's say 3 different types of image, low quality, medium quality, and high quality. And depending on device, app can decide which type of image it will target. So it will reduce the amount of data that we transfer. Same policy we can apply for thumbnails. It also, I mean, using thumbnails and full-size image will depend on UI, on exact UI, how it should look like. But I would believe for list of threads, it would be nice to have some thumbnails because we don't need to have full-size images there. And maybe for thread details, we may want to have full-size images where we use it. So then, for image loading, as I mentioned, we can use separate entity, which we can develop in-house, or we can use open source solution. In case of iOS, it may be Kingfisher as the web image or Alamo Fire Plus image, but we should keep in mind that any third-party dependency will add another potential layer of errors in our app and another potential point of failure. But coming back to the cache, in this case, for image cache, I would go with least frequent usage policy to clean cache. So if we do not view image frequently, I mean, we do not.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to stop you here and just ask a question. So you're gonna maintain 2 separate caching mechanisms, one for images and one for posts, and both of them going to be using LRU for invalidation. So a question: how would you sync them? So imagine like you have already deleted post which you have an image stored.
Very good point.
So like I would like to understand this point.
Very good point. So in this case, cache, sorry, not cache, persistence that we have for threads, in case of removing some thread post information that has thumbnails URL, not image URL, it can ask image component, image loader component to remove these images from cache. By URL, I mean we will use key URL as a key to store image in cache. And in this case, if we are cleaning up threads, our let's call it database or threads cache. We also clean up images cache if we have something there. So that's the way how we can do. But we can have a problem that same image will be used in different threads. And in this case, we will clean up image that will be used. Yeah, that is maybe a problem. We can solve it in two ways. First, we may check if we still have image in database, but it may be quite expensive. I would rather go with way that we clean up, and because it is cache, we can download it again. But that may be not a good solution. And again, depending on the use cases, we may change this logic to check if image URL is used.
Got it. So basically, those you're going to be using URL source keys, and you would need to have something to like keep track of how many times the image been used in like.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's switch gears one more time and talk about likes. So imagine a situation you have the app installed on multiple devices, for example, on your iPhone or iPad, right? And you've been like browsing from both, and for example, you put like likes on like different posts, and those might be the same post. How would you merge them on the device? Because remember, like you cannot really like post multiple times. So you might. So what I'm trying to understand. Imagine both devices are offline, right? So maybe for likes, it's not just like stepping back. So maybe not a good example because it's easy to resolve. But anyway, how would you handle likes in offline scenario?
So, very good question. This will require to introduce some additional logic in persistence that we need to basically, for this kind of thing, we need to store user actions offline. And as soon as we online, we need to kind of upload them to server, send them to server. Will it be like or anything else? But as you mentioned, we can have a case when one user can make like multiple times. We can, first solution that I can think of is to use timestamp on device, but coming back that this mobile device, we cannot rely on time on device because it can be changed at any time and we cannot rely on this. But we may give a policy to server that we will just override if it will receive like to the same post from the same user, it may just override it previous one. And in this case, we will have something like you liked post not 1 day ago when you did it first time, but 1 hour ago that when you did it second time when you your second device went offline online. Sorry. And let me think about other case. Let's say if I'm offline on 2 devices and I'm like same post, I will send 2 requests to the server. Another solution maybe is to get updated information from about this post from server. But if we would consider a case that you describe as a probability of this will be quite low, but lowered to get, updated post information, we need to do it multiple, like much more times. So I would consider it this a bad idea. I would rather go with first solution. Maybe, let me think, maybe we can have some other solution.
Okay, let's look at this use case. So imagine you on device, right? And you've been browsing post and you have some cache. So you have seen a post and you like it. And then you change your mind and you dislike it.
Okay.
Right? And like, how would you, so what I'm trying to understand, what would you store and how would you send your requests?
So in case of if user liked, let's say we have for post, we have additional field, or we can have separate table, something post liked post, where we store post, let's say post ID and some additional information like timestamp, etc. if I dislike it in offline, I just remove entity from this database and it will not go to the server if I didn't synchronize it. But let's say we have such situation when user disliked app in one device and liked in another. That will create conflict that we can have. What policy we can have? First policy, we can still use local device timestamp in order to solve this. That's one solution. Another solution, as I mentioned, a server can use the latest received action or maybe first received action. There's three ways that we can use solve this, but let me think which way will be better. From user point of view, if I believe from user point of view, if we not consider temperate time on device, for user will be more convenient to see his latest decision. If I decided like 5 minutes ago that I like this post, that I would prefer to have this information recorded on server. And for example, I completely forgot that 2 days ago I disliked this post. So I would rather go with this approach because this information, information about if I like or not, is more important for user, much more important for user than like it's much more important time of user decision rather than time when device connected to network and became online. So this is my recommendation in this case.
Okay, so basically this is based on local device time, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, and if we step back to storage question, so you would maintain a separate table when you would record all the likes. So for example, post ID 1, like check it liked, right? So like imagine you've been offline for a while and you put this whole table. So when you get back online, would you just send like the whole table and then you would clear it up, or like at what point you would clean up your storage?
Very good question. So if I would think about this, it would be nice to send batch, I mean, all events at once, if it's possible. Of course, perhaps we should have some reasonable limit here, but I would definitely not to proceed with sending likes one by one because it may, let's say user liked 100 posts, and then we making 100 requests, it will hit our server quite heavily, especially with 1 billion users. So I would proceed with sending some batch of these likes. And as soon as I receive response from server that server accepted my request, then I clean up this part and try to send next batch. But one more thing I would think of is not to send them directly when user come back online immediately. Because at this point, user may, for example, I'm open an app and I want to see the newest information, and I don't care if if app will send like in maybe 1 minute or two, but for me it's important to see list of threads in 1 second instead of 5 seconds. So I would postpone this action until some reasonable time. Again, configure it maybe from backend, but for initially, I would say I would take few minutes, and then only then start to send this information, and maybe use quality of service to prioritize different network requests on API layer. Let's say get thread list and get thread details will have more priorities comparing with send like information. Maybe use something like this, logic like this.
Okay. So imagine another use case. You have two devices, right? And we're using device timestamp. And those devices, let's say the clock is perfectly synchronized. So you would go on one device and just do a bunch of likes, whatever. And then you got your other device and you change your mind. So for example, you the first batch was not sent once the device, the first device batch was not sent. So you just go grab a second device and it's connected to the internet and you may just try to do something, right? So basically, now we have two separate states on two devices. The first device is offline. It's been accumulated. The second device been able to send everything to the backend, but like chronologically, you use the device the first one, which is offline first, and then the second. So now imagine the first device comes online. Would you just go and flash everything? Because technically, if you use device timestamp, that means like this is your first. Would it be overwritten, or how would you manage this kind of conflicts?
Yeah, if we would go with logic that I mentioned, in this case, server will just ignore because timestamp from first device will be older than from new one. But I see one point of improvement. If we heavily rely on such an offline case, sending this information from first device will be useless. I mean, because server just ignore it. So maybe we can think about optimization, and we can get. But the thing is that we may only some of these events may be ignored, conflicting events. I mean, because I was thinking maybe we can introduce something like what is to get status of the user, what the last time he connected, and according to this, maybe we clean up these awaiting actions to send. But then I realized that we may not have conflicting entities in this database. I mean, on the first device, I liked completely different posts. On second device, I liked another post. And then if I send them all together, there will be no conflict. But in order to determine this, if we really need to solve such cases, we may also get information about user actions from the server and make decision to send or not send based on this. But if we think about cost of this logic, I would not recommend to proceed with this, because then before sending any kind of batch of user actions, we need to get user actions, which again load our server too much, or maybe not too much, but it will definitely load our server. And in most of the cases, I'm not sure about probability, but I believe in maybe 95% of the cases it will be useless information. Or we can consider one more case, because we may know when user has two devices, because we identify this somehow. I mean, we have authentication layer, and we can consider, for example, for a case when user has only one device, we use this like we don't have any of this complex logic. But let's say if user has 30 devices, then we may implement some custom logic for these kind of users, where we handle this. But again, it will be really, from my point of view, overload in particular in our case, and I would rather proceed with using local timestamp, and then on server side just to compare timestamp and ignore events with conflicting events with earlier timestamp.
Okay, right. We've been going for an hour. It's a bit over time, but since you're like more senior candidate, people would usually allocate more time for interview. So yeah, let's jump to the feedback I have. I'm gonna share the document. You can bring back the screen, so this way we can look at the drawing itself. Like,
can you see it?
Yes. Let's scroll all the way up, and maybe make it a bit bigger, because I know that this recording is going to be small. Okay, so if we start with an intro, it was pretty short. So I would probably put more emphasis on experience and responsibility. So you mentioned about like team size and like all the different companies, but like most likely the interviewer would have your resume ready and can see it. It's more like an icebreaker, but would be nice. Like, okay, so we have a team of 50 people, and this is what I've been doing, etc. Not necessary, but as I said, it's probably much more relevant than the name of the startup, because I never heard of those companies. But otherwise, it's good. Then we jump to requirements. It took about 5 minutes, which is a good time. What I would say, like sometimes questions like about offline, at this point, it's a must. It's not even like up for discussion. And I would also recommend you to suggest more of the functionality and not ask for it, because you are a senior candidate, and senior candidate is supposed to be in the driver's seat. So you create more answers than you create questions, because like you work directly with stakeholders, and they would need somebody who would make decisions. iOS version recommendation, like 3 versions, is generally okay, but I would go like much more aggressive, because we try to cover as much market as possible. And one of the things we discussed that it's worldwide. That means that we're going to be covering countries with people with very old devices who cannot afford to update their device like every year. So I would go all the way up and try to say, okay, we can go until version 10, because starting with version 10, we got some functionality which we can live without. So not a big deal, but I would probably be more aggressive here. Asking about the team size and modularization is a good point. That shows that you are more on a, like, you think about technical leadership, not just how to build stuff, right? Not like technology itself. The scope of the task is good as well. So what I'm missing from this one, like we really didn't discuss lots of stuff about specific of the content and application itself. Like one good question is, okay, so what is expected size of the post? So for example, like how many images they want to upload, how much text, etc. Like how many posts we would expect. Do we want to care about prefetching and any kind of other like optimization? So it's more like from a business point of view, especially like prefetching, because if you take something like Reddit, you open up, there's always something to see. It's just not a single case where you would open something and it's going to be empty, because user attention span is very short. If they're not going to see any content in like 3 seconds, they're going to pause it and go use some other app. So I'll probably expect like more like to dig deeper here, but once again, it really depends on what the interviewer is looking for, and as long as you can lay down a good MVP, it's probably fine. But as a senior person, you're expected to also bring lots of like strategic kind of points. So you would really want to know more, because you're responsible for delivering the product, and now you would need to pass down such requirements to the team. But overall, I guess it was good. High-level discussion. So you start drawing this diagram, which is exactly what the guide has. And so you brought app module. The purpose was not really clear. So you say app module like is executable part of the app, and it just gonna glue everything together. This is when you're gonna initialize your subsystems, like passing down IDs, whatever you would need to do. Push notification handling, it's like kind of dangling in the air. So we said, okay, it's going to be part of app module, but now we want to have as a component, then it's going to be go notify repository. So like this whole communication, how this component fits was not really clear. Flow communication, yes, it's good to say that everything is better to be separated in different flows. But maybe picking up a concrete UI architecture pattern would be beneficial. So for example, it seems to me what you're trying to describe, it's something like, it's more like clean architecture, maybe on MVI side. And there might be like coordinator pattern involved, because you mentioned navigation, plus you use repository data. So if you like put it in a very well-defined terms, it's much easier to understand than trying to see, oh, this company is going to be doing this, because those are well-known things. Okay, navigation. This part was not clear in terms of responsibility. So At one point, navigation handles business logic. As the other type, navigation handles navigation, like actual screen. I would prefer each companies be like very limited in terms of they do. And they would communicate via use cases. I would probably not go with low-level primitives like RX or whatever, like callbacks. You just pass an object, like one object which encapsulates everything you need to do. And you said, hey, I want to select straight, and you just invoke this call on this object, and you never care about if it's going to be a concurrent request, what's going to happen. And navigation doesn't really know about those things. It can just like pass it down to whatever call, or you can encapsulate it in like completely different component. So like encapsulation is the key because it's easier to separate, easier to test, because if it runs both business logic and navigation, so now each test would involve like, okay, I'm checking the actual like changes to data model, whatever, plus I'm gonna see the screen. So it might make it challenging, especially as the complexity of the app grows. So now you have not just a single navigation graph, you have like navigation graph with nodes which in terms are navigation graphs themselves. So it's better to keep everything decoupled. We also talk about too much about navigation, and like we spent a lot of time talking about it, but I didn't get any clear signal. So it's like go in circles. At least this is like what I felt. And remember, the interview is very biased because it really depends on the perception of the interviewer of like what you deliver. So it's very nice to be very concise and clear of what you're trying to deliver. Repository scope, yeah, it's a good part, but then we start talking about interfaces, like having single class, and now like there is a potential problems that it doesn't scale. So imagine we keep adding flows, and now there's this one class, it becomes gigantic, and we can't really find a very good owner for this, because if like two teams own it, now we have communication issue. So now there's a chance that one team going to be working on something without the other team knowing about it. So like if it's not a part of like single entity in terms of like people working on the same stuff, there's always going to be communication issues. You can bet on this. Yeah, like team separation, you started like bringing ideas about team separations, which is really good point. Like as I said, it's better to be assertive. Like, okay, this is what I'm going to be using, and this is why. So for example, it worked well in my experience because it's very biased and there's no like one size fits it all. You also said, oh, I'm going to be syncing with business requirements. This is not very clear. The point is you are talking to stakeholders, you're making decisions. There is basically no higher authority than yourself. Like I'm talking about senior candidates, and we're talking about 10 plus years, right? So you make decisions. Like mostly folks which you talk to, they're not technical. They if you're going to start talking about static dynamics frameworks, they will have no idea. For what it was, you said, okay, we're going to be using monorepo, for example, because it's much easier to make sure that versioning is the same. So imagine like you have different repositories and they all like in different versions. So how do you build? Which version would you put? Would you also put like a head? Or so there's lots of pros and cons you can mention, but I would probably not go to like, oh, it's going to be, could be dynamic, could be static, and static would, like, for example, increase binary size and stuff like that. It's
That's
too much information.
Too much technical information.
Too much technical information, and I would just be like have a very good clear cut. Okay, I'm going to be using this for this specific reason. So, for example, if we're using like separate repos, we're going to have this going to be convenient because people not going to step on each other's toes. But now we can have like versioning help. So, especially you imagine you try to build a version of the app from the past, right? And now you would need to see which snapshots of each repo I need to use. So that becomes extremely challenging. And you might want to build, like, why would you want to build it? Sometimes you would need to like get some bug behavior. So imagine like there's a bug report and you said, oh, we probably solved it, but let me go back and maybe like update a couple versions back, like roll back a couple versions back and just capture some data container and then use it. So now you can't use it because you would need to have exactly the same. You can say, okay, I can introduce any kind of like maybe a package version, and now I'm going to have each one of them as a package and version, but it has like lots of complexity. But the point is there's always trade-off. Like everything you do, you're gonna have a negative effect. And your job as a lead just to make sure that this like cumulative effect is low as possible. And you're thinking about like in a very, very high level. And if you need any like technical details, you can always find a dedicated person who would be able to answer like any questions you may have. You don't really need to be like that close to metal, but like your decisions become more strategic. Okay, so we go to API and like I would say this is not what I expected. Like actually getting this like get and data stuff, it's not very exciting, especially for technical lead. So what it will need to do, like first thing, you would need to select protocol, right? So we said, okay, we're going to be using REST JSON. Why? Because it's easy. So we can just like get like junior members working on this. There's a very little overhead in terms of like setting things up. So we can start really quick, right? It's human readable, it's well documented, but at the same time, lots of overhead, right? So maybe we want to use like GraphQL, but maybe we won't because our requests are not that configurable. Or if we want to use protobufs, protobufs are very compact, and protobufs has amazing backward compatibility. Protobufs is scheme-based, so you can verify it at build time. JSON, now like versioning issues. So for example, what happens to our current clients if we bump up or change the version? So I would really like to hear about versioning, like how to make sure that the backend and the client are in constant sync. How would you define those? Would you write them manually? Would they use any tool which would generate code for you? So like if you go in as a senior candidate, technical details are not that important. It's more about strategic decision, especially in the long run, and how to make sure that your team is productive. So also like, but you mentioned it, retries, DDoS attack protection, authorization, and handling code. So for example, we said, oh, we might want to make sure that we don't generate too much traffic. That means that is it coming from a single user or is it like our servers are busy and can take the load. So if it's single user, it's 429 and Reddit has been like very religious in this. If you post something and you try to make another post and say, oh, you're doing too much, wait for like 10 minutes, etc. Yeah, and also good to think about scale. And you mentioned is that, okay, yes, we need to be very mindful of what we do to not overload our servers ourselves. And like one thing which I also expected to hear, maybe like quality of service, which you mentioned down the road. So not all the requests are born equal in terms of like some I have higher priority, some not. So for example, getting the list of threads is a higher priority than fetching thumbnails. But fetching thumbnails is a higher priority than actually fetching full REST images. Then I guess we also got, this was part of, oh yeah, it was part of images. Okay, so let's skip. In terms of caching, like when I would think in terms of caching, I would probably think in terms of disks and memory usage. So we mentioned LRU cache and like number of posts, and then try to do some math on like how to do that. I would probably start with, okay, we want to use no more than, for example, 400 megabyte of space. Whatever gets there, gets there. How would we invalidate? We might want it to make configurable, and then you said, okay, it might be HTTP cache policy, or it could be a remote configuration. If it's remote configuration, how often do we update? What defaults we would get, etc. Can user like prune the cache because disk space runs low, and they would first uninstall the apps, which are biggest one. Also, at some point, you started negotiating back. So I just keep throwing requirements which might or might not make sense, and you push it back. This is good. This is exactly what you have to do as a lead, because sometimes stakeholders just want things which doesn't make sense or would not provide lots of benefits, but would have a very huge cost. So pushing back is very good, and I think you did well here. Yeah, and from in terms of policy configuration, that part was not clear. It's like we talk about remote config, about default values like post size and mask. So the overall solution was very complicated and it was very hard to follow. So try to keep it simple, and it's better to deliver something simple and then have follow-up questions than just try to like, oh, this is a solution which is gonna involve anything, everything like possible. So like remember, you're trying to provide signal, and it's better to be like very short and concise and let the interviewer to dig in deeper and know exactly like what they want to have. Okay, so then we jump to images, and you said, okay, I'm gonna have a separate cache. Once again, once you have separate caches, you would need to sync them somehow, right? And then you would say, okay, I would say, oh, I'm gonna request images from this size, which makes sense, but at the same time, like what are pros and cons? If your requests are highly configurable, that really limits the possibility of server-side caching. And we're talking about 1 billion users. So if you look at Reddit API, they send you images, image URLs for every screen size possible, and let the client pick what they want. Why they need to do that? Because they can basically like generate posts on the backend and caching in memory. And then everyone said like, hey, I need images. I need this like thread with posts. Here we go. And it can invalidate and update. But if you said, oh, I want to have it for this screen size, now the backend would need to go look it up, build the response, and send it back. And we're talking about 1 billion users. So you should be mindful of it. You remember that what may not be a big deal on the client might be a deal breaker on the backend. Like as I said, I'm stressing this one more time. 1 billion users, so a lot of people. Then we started to talking about library vendors. Library vendors are not that important, especially if you go into big companies like from FANG. They will have their own custom solutions. It's pretty unlikely they're going to be using any kind of 3P. They could be, but in many cases, they roll out their own system, which precedes like anything on the market. And it really depends on the team. So just roll up vendors, I would not say it's very important, but it's good that you mentioned some of the issues with third parties. The first one is privacy. Privacy, binary compatibility, bugs, crashes, like you name it. Like with this case when like Facebook SDK crashed like a bunch of apps a couple of years back, right? So there's always liability. And what I would say, if you use 3P, make sure that they are flag guarded. So for example, oh, if you see there is something wrong, you just like hit the button and it just shuts down. So otherwise, like you would not get like massive app crashes, which gonna drive your operations. Because users don't care about what libraries you use, all they care about how stable that is. Okay, I'm gonna be using URLs as keys. Like, are there any disadvantages to this? Because if we're talking about CDN, like any kind of static resources, the URLs are very, very long, right? So I would say, I would bring a couple of things. So I would say URLs, very concise, easy to follow, but kind of like an overhead. Plus, would the URL be stable, depending like regions and stuff? Then it could be a unique identifier which backend generates. So might be like maybe better in terms of privacy, so because now we can't like easily get like the URL if you compromise the data. I'm not sure if it's a big deal or not, but just throwing a couple of things. And as far as I can see, not that many APIs actually operate with URLs. They usually have like resource ID, and there is some mechanism to pull this resource from the backend or from the cache, etc. But as I said, it's not rule of thumb. Make sure that you not just like throw a solution. You say why, like why you want to do that, what's good, what's bad about, what's alternative, and why you would want to select this particular one. Then we talk about likes, and I admit I kind of dropped the ball here. I got the whole idea as a conflicting state and opportunity state, but it would make sense if we actually can edit posts. So opportunistic state means that like the user is able to perform actions without any network connection, right? And then it's going to be some kind of synchronization. It can be like backend side, client side, you name it. Like as I said, like what I would expect from you is just to bring lots of options. So I said, okay, we might want to run opportunistic state, and now we want to handle conflicts on the backend. And pros for this, it's flexible. We can go and just change it anytime we want. Cons, we might want to have extra requests back and forth, like for settling the conflict. Second option, we would use like client side, which is much easier to implement, but everything we ship with a mobile app is final. So it's not flexible in terms of delivering updates. And it's probably going to take a couple of weeks to months while you deliver all your updates to all the clients, right? Yeah, so I tried to push you in this conflict resolution phase, but I guess on my side, I didn't think this through. So, but it happens. Sometimes the interviewer did not like think the question through or didn't prepare correctly. And if you can see where it's going, you said like, okay, like what exact problem do you have in mind which we have to solve? Because I might not be following. And then I would say, okay, this is what I actually need. So I would say, if it doesn't make sense, you would question the requirements, and like you try to negotiate yourself out, which was a good start, but then kind of starts throwing like, okay, we have like 30 devices and some probability. Like I would try to push more. I would say like, you know what, it's probably not a big deal in this case. Like what I would do, I would never use timestamp. I would never use any client generated resources because it's a very good opportunity to abuse the API. So if you bump your clock like forward, you would always win, right? So you can trust device clock. Basically, you cannot device anything. You cannot trust anything which was generated on device. That's rule of thumb. Yeah, but be ready to negotiate back if you feel like requirements make no sense. So maybe in this case, like n likes in the ways that we really need to pursue like complex negotiation state is not that important because in many cases users just like scroll like they don't care, they never go back and say how I wonder how my post like is doing. Okay, so for high level summary, lots of good stuff. You're clearly senior person. But what am I suggest? So more solutions for your questions. Your whole design was very indecisive. It's like you not sure what you're doing and need to constantly ask for like validation and feedback. Like, oh, like, do you think we need this? And you're in the driver's seat. You like, I'm just a stakeholder. I came to you to know the solution, right? And you have to deliver it. And this way you should be way more assertive. Because if you're indecisive, like your whole team is going to be indecisive. You should be a strong leader and make decisions like it's okay to make mistakes as long as you fix them. So you can know everything, but at least you should be like assertive in this case. I also can see lots of irrelevant details, lots of like implementation details or some going back and forth. Remember, you are very limited on time. Everything you say should provide signal. And last point, your solutions felt very complex. It's like unnecessary details. Sometimes you would try to add more requirements. I would be very careful with this because if you're talking to stakeholders and you would say like, oh, maybe we can edit post. And it's like, oh, that's a great idea. But guess what? They're not going to give you more time or more people. So now you overcommitted to something and like your team might be not happy and then you can start losing people. And like you're responsible. That's like once a point, you can't really do much, but you're responsible for the outcome. And this way, you should be like less opportunistic in terms of like what can be delivered, and try to only work on important things. That means you have to push back and say, okay, that sounds good, but I don't feel that we have capacity like this quarter for this. Or if we, for example, wanted to add this, what else should we deprioritize? So like, I'm not sure if it's a correct approach or not, but if I would interview senior people, I would expect them to challenge my requirements in whatever I say. Because like if they just agree with you, that's not a good because they're going to tell you exactly what you want to hear and it's going to like hide problems. And that's not going to be good in the long run. So this is my perception. As I said, I'm not an interview expert. I don't represent any company. But yeah, so now I would like to take it back to the audience and see like what your thoughts both about the candidate and the interviewer performance. Anyone? Okay, Vitaly, so what's your self-assessment? What do you think you did good? What you can work on, and what's your like overall?
So in general, I have feeling that like first part was okay, fine, but then I started to losing track, and as you mentioned, like diving in too much technical details, or um, for example, with navigation, didn't think about how exactly to explain my idea, and maybe it makes sense to invest more time into these details that may raise up in any interview. Yeah, and very good thing about pushback. That's really good feedback. Let's say, as you mentioned, maybe let's consider this case as really not important. It will happen in maybe 0.5% of the cases, and we can just not overcomplicate our solution because of this. So, and very good points. I really like that you mentioned like you are discussing with stakeholder. So assume it's not technical guide, do not overload with technical details, keep it simple, and it's like real app implementation where you again discussing what we can implement in which way, and I believe I really overloaded with the technical details and too much into it in the second part, where it may be pretty straightforward solution with clear pros and cons. That believe the biggest my biggest mistake in this interview. So in general, that's my perception.
Yeah,
And
so
I have feeling messed up and like slightly messed in the second part of interview, like too much information going on, and yeah, that was harder.
yeah, as I mentioned last time, it's really easy to be a spectator, but not as easy to be in a driver's seat. So in terms of like pushing back, like what I want to stress out, if you push back, you should explicitly mention this. So for example, it's not, oh, I'm not going to do that. You would say, okay, in my experience, this feature might have diminishing returns. So like I would probably not like build it like full scale or would not build it at all because like that would much like distract the team. So basically you explicitly said that you try to negotiate and you said, okay, so in my experience, I would like if I have requirements like this, I would try to push back and negotiate and maybe see if we can like maybe reduce it or maybe push it to like next quarter or something like this. But don't be like, oh, it's not important. It should be like
Mhm.
you sending the signal, and the signal is sending is not like, oh, I don't want to do this, it's not fun. The signal is, I don't think that it's important, and I'm wondering if we can push it back. If not, if interview said, no, this is important, then you deliver. From point of view, like it's very important to stress that this mock interview is a senior candidate. The higher you go in a hierarchy, the less technical you become. At some point, you don't think like how to build. You think what to build. So you are not the one who's going to be writing code, but it only applicable for high-level interviews. If we go a couple levels down, if we go like L4 or 5, that's going to be pure technical. So for L4, for example, I would expect, okay, let's build this scrolling list with some, like how would you fetch stuff? Like how would you store whatever? So it's like go more and more technical. Like level 5 can be a bit more high level. It's like how would you organize everything? And level 6, it's all about bad weather. Okay, so now we have version complete. We have bugs, like something crashes, third party crashes. Like what do you do? Or like we we want to reduce the loading time, like for like make it 1 second faster because we're losing our customer base. And like it's all about strategy at this point and less technical because this is what your responsibility is going to be. Um, yeah, in terms of like going too far, if you find yourself that you like speaking too much, and maybe just going, you see, you can stop yourself here and ask like if it makes sense. Like, does it make sense? Like, do you want me to keep going there, or should we like go somewhere else? Do you have any question? It's very important to like since we're doing video conferences this day, it's very important to look at your interviewer and read their facial expression. So if you can see that they start to change their faces, like they're trying to ask something, you can stop and say, okay, it feels like you have some questions. So don't wait until they would like to interrupt you, because sometimes it doesn't feel polite to interrupt. But at the same time, you're taking your own time. So like try to read your interviewer body language and facial expression as much as possible. Some would just sit and stare at you blankly. It can happen to you, but you remember that your goal is not to build a system. Your goal is to provide signal. And like this communication is very important. Okay, anyone from audience, like, I wonder if you have any feedback.
Hi guys, I started not from start, but it was interesting this one, and I also wanted to ask: is there like a good solution for this offline situation when you have like offline updates on two devices and when you need to update from both of it? Like, is there kind of good practices?
May I try to answer, give high-level answer? It really depends on the case. I mean, it's one case when you have different likes from device, another case if you have to do app with synchronization. I mean, it really, like, there's no good solution for all cases.
Actually,
It depends.
complex case. Is it really like question for this kind of interview, or it can be?
Yeah, no one expects you to deliver a solution, especially like a perfect solution, especially if you never work with this. So for example, if Italy never work with pagination, right? Uh, like, or only using like offset-based pagination and nothing else, it's very hard to like deliver something. So it's better to say that I don't have experience. So like one thing which I forget to mention, there was a point when it was about pagination when Italy say, I don't have strong preference. I would not put it this way. You should have strong preferences. In this case, you don't have experience.
Mhm.
So I would say I don't have experience. I might go back and consult with our backend folks, because pagination really depends like technology we use and stuff like that. But offset pagination is usually a wrong answer, especially if like your content changes. Like, I'm not sure like if it's, well, let's see, can we add like posts in the beginning? I don't know. But usually the problem is it's so-called like sliding window. So when you get to the next page and now some content being inserted, and now you can see the same stuff over and over again. And I saw it in many different apps. So it exists. Like cursor-based pagination or key set pagination might be a better candidate. There's lots of information about this over the internet. So one point of system design, don't just rely on your own experience, because your experience would most likely be very limited. Just go and learn what other people do. And there's like lots of excellent blogs from top-notch companies. So we just find whatever company you like, um, go to the dev blog and see like mobile, iOS, Android, whatever, and they solve lots of very interesting problems, and they tell you about it, and that really helped me in my Facebook interview. I read the whole every post in the dev blog, and when I got a relevant question, I said, okay, I didn't work with this much, but I know how it's built in WhatsApp, and the guy was from WhatsApp, so we discussed it. It was fun. Except for like, oh, I have no idea, but let me speculate. So the key is preparation, I guess.
And one another small point that overview picture or high level design is like the same as like in Alexei's article, and at least for us it looks like you just draw the copy. And
Okay, it's Alexander, right? And yes, that's the point when like I wherever I did mocks with people, many of them would try to squeeze anything into this, even if they tried to build a library. And this is not rule of thumb. That was for this one particular case. And be mindful of this. Like, especially if an interviewer, like, for example, read the framework, or imagine I'm the interview, right? And it's like, okay, so it's pretty much like copy paste from the article. You should be like very mindful what you do, or at least be like you know exactly what you're doing, because like if it makes sense, you can use it, but it's okay. You need to explain exactly which company is doing and why it exists in the first place. Because otherwise it feels like kind of just trying to squeeze whatever task at hand into an existing approach. Yes, Nessa?
Yeah, so I have a question about one of your feedback. So you said that when Vitaly went to implementation details, it was a bad signal. Why is that? Is it because of the senior level?
Yes. We're talking about somebody who's been around for 15 years.
All right, thanks.
I would say it's not about going into implementation, but putting too many details, right?
All right. Okay.
But if you lower level and your interviewer might want to know exactly how you're going to build like UI part. Like if you use, for example, I don't know, use cases, like what exact use cases are going to be used? How would you put concurrency in place? That would make sense, but I would mostly interview senior candidates. And I believe it's the most fun because it's a much broader conversation. And when you use particular technology, it tends to grow old really quick. So today you use one library, tomorrow another. So it doesn't scale in terms of like, if you watch the interview recording like a couple of years after, it makes no sense because nobody's using this. And second point, take everything I say with a grain of salt. As I said, this is completely my own opinion. It's based on my experience and my firm beliefs. I do not represent any company. So like whatever I said, it's not necessarily going to go to company X and it's going to make your interview round successful. I got some positive feedback from people who actually got offers by using this, but it really depends on the interviewer. So interviewer might want to see something completely different or have like another perception of the interview, and you can really shoot yourself in the foot. So this way you read the body language, you look at facial expression, and constantly asking that, like what are you doing makes sense to them. It's not like, oh, should I use this and this? It's that, oh, I'm going to be drawing a high level company diagram. Does it make sense? Do you want me to go this way? And they said, nah, it's fine. Let's just talk about database. And he said, okay, I'm gonna draw like an entity relationship diagram. Would that make sense? Yes, sure. Or if discuss an API, I said, okay, I'm gonna render a typical response, request response, because like they might not be that interested in this, and they just try to want to be polite and not interrupt you, and you just taking your valuable time.
I have one more remark, small one, maybe not related to interview, but always double check before interview which instruments you will use. For example, before I usually used Zoom, and in Zoom you can select which screen you will present. But suddenly in Google Meet, I can select only one screen, and it will kind of ruin my setup because I need to switch. For example, I didn't have chat on separate screen, and was not able to, for example, look at my colleague. So it's kind of, decreased my performance. So always be mindful and double check, microphones, all set up, what software you will use, double check that everything works properly because it may really affect your results.
You might lose valuable time, and that's a very good point. I would say most likely if you know Excalibur and Google Draw or Google Jamboard, you probably covered like 90% cases. Some people would allow you to use any tool of your choice, and many would use Lucidchart, which is like one of my favorite drawing tools. But like bigger companies, if we're talking about Facebook, most likely Excalibur. If we're talking about Google, it's going to be Jamboard, Google Draw, or nothing at all. Sometimes it's just text-based discussion when you have Google Doc and you just type. It depends. It depends on person's style. Yeah. Anyone else? All right. So,
hi guys, I have a question. Thank you for interview. The first part of interview was more Vitaly draw a lot and write a lot of things on whiteboard, but second part was more verbal. Is it okay or not?
Depends on personal style of the interviewer. So, like, if I want to get more signal, and I've been doing my notes, it was fine for me. Like, generally, you can try to put like more stuff in your drawing, but remember, there's always a trade-off. I would say if it's something important, make sure to fix it. So, for example, oh, I'm going to be using, so we discussed code organization. So I would just put like two sentences. The first one, like multiple repositories and static frameworks. So then when the interview looks at the drawings, like, okay, I remember this. If it's like more verbal discussion, maybe like selecting pros and cons. Honestly, I have no idea. It really depends on the interview. For me, it was fine. Like at least
Because,
hmm?
yeah, go on.
I said at least I would be able to write report and submit it. So I got all the information, all the signal. So the signal I got from Vitaly, there's still some work to do. Would be good to go and learn basic stuff in terms of like working with network stack, like all the codes, everything you would need to know, like DOS attacks. It's many like tiny nitty-gritty details which you would not really see unless you work with those things. And but at the same time, I can see a strong signal. I would probably put it as a weak hire. So this way you should really shine on coding and behavioral. Also, if you more senior candidates, they're probably not going to graduate much in coding. So the system design behavior might have the biggest impact. But as I said, like don't take anything a random internet stranger says to you. Like you can always verify, you can talk to other people and see what makes most sense to yourself.
And I can add to answer particular in this case. The problem is that our brain, like when it's overloaded, it's harder to make two things at the same time. And usually typing or drawing and talking and thinking is very hard to do at the same time when you need to allocate all resources to thinking. So you see explicitly when I stopped drawing, that means I was much more in thinking than in like all resources was dedicated there. So that also depends on the person in this case. And by the way, but you can develop a habit that you can just type everything that you are saying or summarizing. But again, you need to train on this.
Practice makes perfect. The more you do, the more it goes from your brain to your spinal cord.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I understand. Anyway, it was great. Thank you for it.
My usual disclaimer, if you feel like, for example, Vitaly drops the ball at some point, like try to take his place. I tell you, it's not as easy as you think, because when you a spectator, you're like very relaxed. You can see obvious mistakes, like, oh, I would do it like completely different, or I would totally nail it. That's very hard to do when you're in the spotlight. I think Vitaly did great. Restoring some practice won't hurt, but it's already a very solid foundation, at least in my opinion. All right. Any other feedback? All right. If not, I would assume that everything else was perfect, and I'll probably see you guys next week.
Thanks to you and thanks to everyone for looking, and have a nice rest of the week.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Right.